August 5, 1981. That is the date nobody taught you in school. Not in economics class, not in history, not in any conversation about why you cannot get ahead no matter how hard you work. That morning, the President of the United States walked to the Rose Garden and fired 11,345 people. In 48 hours. By name. Permanently. They were air traffic controllers. They had gone on strike 2 days earlier, demanding better pay and shorter hours. Ronald Reagan gave them an ultimatum. Return to work or lose your career. 11,345 of them did not return. So he fired every single one. Let that sink in for a moment. These were not unskilled workers. These were people trained to manage the collision of thousands of aircraft simultaneously. They were replaced within 12 days. The planes kept flying, and corporate America watched every second of it. Here is what nobody told you. The firing was not just a labor dispute. It was a message, sent at full volume to every employer in the United States. The message was this: you can do this too. Within 12 months, the Wharton School of Business published a printed manual teaching executives how to replicate what Reagan had done, how to break a strike, how to replace workers, how to decertify a union. Donald Devine, director of the Office of Personnel Management, said it plainly. When the president said no, American business leaders were given a lesson in managerial leadership that they could not and did not ignore. They did not ignore it. In 1983, 1 in 5 American workers carried a union card. Today it is 1 in 10. In the private sector, 1 in 17. The loyalty contract between employer and worker began dissolving the moment those 11,345 people cleared their desks. Nobody held a funeral. Nobody announced what had died. That is what this video is about. The exact moment the career contract broke. The forensic evidence of what happened after. And why you feel it every single day, even if you have never heard the name PATCO in your life. If that is the kind of history nobody teaches you, subscribe to The Money Architect. And tell me in the comments, when did you first realize the old career rules no longer applied to you? To understand what broke on August 5, 1981, you need to understand what existed before it. Because something real existed, something that actually worked, and its disappearance was not inevitable. It was chosen. From 1948 to 1979, the American economy ran on a simple mechanism. Workers produced more. Workers got paid more. That was it. That was the whole system. Productivity and wages moved together, almost in lockstep. The Economic Policy Institute has tracked this data for decades. Between 1948 and 1979, productivity rose 108%. Wages rose 93%. Not identical, but close enough that when the economy grew, the people who built that growth actually felt it in their paychecks. Pay attention to that period. 31 years. An entire generation of American workers who could reasonably expect that working harder meant earning more, that staying loyal meant building something, that a job was the beginning of a life, not just a mechanism for covering rent while waiting for something better. Your grandparents lived inside that system. It was not perfect. It was not equal for everyone. But the basic mechanism functioned. The contract between employer and worker was real. You give effort, you receive reward. You give years, you receive security. Simple. verifiable, true. Now here is what is actually happening. That contract did not erode gradually. It did not fade because of technology or globalization or any of the comfortable explanations you were handed later. It broke at a specific moment. The break was so clean, so sudden, that economists can draw a precise line on a chart and say this is before and this is after. The line runs through 1979. Some trace it to 1980. The forensic evidence points to one event that crystallized everything that followed. August 1981. But to understand why that moment was so decisive, you need to understand what unions actually were. Not the caricature, not the political football, the economic function. A union was a pricing mechanism. Nothing more complicated than that. When workers bargain alone, an employer can offer the minimum the market will accept, and the worker who needs the job takes it. When workers bargain collectively, the floor rises. The employer must compete on pay. In industries with strong union density, wages were higher, not just for union members but for every worker in the surrounding labor market. The threat of organizing kept non-union employers honest. You did not have to carry a card to benefit from someone else's card. In 1955, union membership in the United States peaked at roughly 35% of the total workforce. 1 in 3 workers. That density meant the pricing mechanism had real power. A company could not simply fire its way to lower labor costs without facing organized resistance. Workers had leverage, not unlimited leverage, but enough to keep the contract alive. Then, slowly through the 1960s and into the 1970s, that leverage began to thin. Deindustrialization, automation in certain sectors, anti-union legal maneuvering. The leverage did not collapse, but it weakened. And then came August 1981, and it did not weaken further. It shattered. Here is the part nobody says out loud. The disappearance of union power is not a story about lazy workers or industries that deserve to die. It is a story about a deliberate policy decision that transferred the pricing power from labor to capital, from the people doing the work to the people owning the enterprise. Reagan did not begin that transfer, but on August 5, 1981, he accelerated it beyond any previous speed, with the full authority of the federal government, in public, on nation, so that every business owner in America could see precisely what was now permitted. Here is the sequence of events. Precise. Documented. In order. August 3, 1981. 13,000 members of the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization walk off the job. PATCO. They want a wage increase of $10,000 per controller per year. They want a shorter working week. They want updated equipment. The Federal Aviation Administration has offered $40 million in concessions. PATCO is asking for $770 million. The gap is enormous. Negotiations have collapsed entirely. The strike begins at 7 a.m. Reagan goes to the Rose Garden, reads a statement. Federal employees are prohibited by law from striking against the public safety. Each controller signed a no-strike oath when they took the job. Is giving them 48 hours to return. Anyone who does not return will be terminated. Permanently. Their jobs will not be held. There will be no negotiation after the deadline. The deadline passes. 11,345 controllers do not return. Reagan fires every one of them. On August 5, 1981, he signs the termination orders. The Federal Labor Relations Authority begins decertification proceedings immediately. By October 22, 1981, PATCO is formally dissolved. The first federal union in American history to be decertified by the government it served. The band controllers are told they will never work as air traffic controllers again. The ban is not lifted until 1993, when President Clinton resigns it 12 years later. Now here is the detail that changes everything. PATCO had endorsed Ronald Reagan in the 1980 presidential election. Robert Poley, the PATCO president, had received a personal letter from Reagan in October 1980. In that letter, Reagan wrote that he would work to provide controllers with modern equipment and adjust staffing levels to achieve maximum public safety. Poley showed that letter to his members. It was part of why they voted to back Reagan over Carter. They believed the promise. They acted on it. 10 months after that letter, Reagan fired them all. But it gets worse. The administration did not treat the firing as a regrettable necessity. It treated it as a demonstration. Donald Davine, the director of the Office of Perhoffen Management, stated it explicitly. When the president said no, American business leaders were given a lesson in managerial leadership that they could not and did not ignore. Lesson, that is the word he used. Not a tragedy, not a crisis, a lesson. Within 12 months, the Wharton School of Business published a formal manual. Printed, distributed, curriculum-grade material for executives in the private sector, teaching them how to apply the PATCO model to their own workforces, how to identify a strike before it begins, how to prepare replacement workers in advance, how to sustain operations without the employees currently on your payroll, how to decertify a union and ensure it never reforms. The lesson spread with extraordinary speed. Striking copper miners in Arizona. Fired, replaced. Striking paper workers in Maine. Fired, replaced. Within 2 years, the pattern Reagan demonstrated in the public sector had been absorbed entirely into private industry. Historian Joseph McCartan of Georgetown University, who spent years researching this period and wrote the definitive account in his 2011 book Collision Course, concluded that the PATCO defeat was one of the most important events in late 20th century American labor history. Not one of the most publicized, one of the most important. The difference matters, because you were not supposed to connect those events. You were not supposed to understand that a decision about federal air traffic controllers in 1981 had anything to do with your salary in 2024. That is not a coincidence. That is how the lesson was designed to function. This is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. In the years immediately following 1981, private sector strike activity collapsed. In 1952, there had been 470 major work stoppages in the United States. By 1990, that number had fallen to 44. By 2009, it had reached 5. Workers did not stop having grievances. They stopped believing that expressing those grievances would produce anything other than a termination letter. The memory of 11,345 people losing everything made that calculation very easy. Silence was not peace. It was the sound of a workforce that had learned its lesson. And surrender, even quiet surrender, has a price. The bill arrived every year for the next 4 decades, and it is still arriving now. The PATCO story did not emerge from nowhere. To understand why it worked so completely, you need to go back further. Because the relationship between governments, employers, and workers has broken this way before. The pattern is old. Only the names change. Consider what happened in Britain in 1926. The general strike. 9 days in May. 1.5 million workers walk out in solidarity with coal miners, who have been told their wages will be cut and their working hours extended. Miners, transport workers, printers, dockers, construction workers. The country stops. For 9 days, Britain sees what organized labor looks like when it uses its full power. The Conservative government under Stanley Baldwin does not negotiate. It calls the strikers a threat to the Constitution. It organizes volunteers to run essential services. Waits. After 9 days, the Trades Union Congress capitulates without a single concession. The miners hold out alone for 6 more months. Then they return to work, on worse terms than before the strike. The lesson governments and employers drew from 1926 was identical to the lesson drawn from 1981. Organized labor, when confronted with state power deployed without hesitation, loses. The key word is hesitation. The moment a government flinches, workers gain ground. The moment it does not flinch, the structure of the entire labor market shifts. Pay attention to this number. After the 1926 general strike, British Union membership fell from 5 million to 7 million in 2 years, a collapse of 33%. Wages in the coal industry were cut. The working week was extended. And the Trade Disputes Act on 1927 made general strikes illegal for the next 20 years. A single confrontation rewrote the rules for a generation. Reagan knew this history. His advisors knew it. The PATCO strike did not catch them unprepared. Files declassified decades later show that the administration had been planning its response to a potential PATCO strike for months before the walkout. Replacement worker logistics were mapped. Military controller deployments were pre-arranged. The 48-hour ultimatum was not improvised under pressure. It was the final move in a strategy designed to produce exactly one outcome. Here is what most people miss. The controllers were not the target. The audience was. The target was every private sector employer watching from their offices. Every boardroom that had been negotiating with unions under the assumption that the rules of the game were fixed. What Reagan demonstrated was that the rules were not fixed. They were a choice. And a government willing to make a different choice could redraw them completely. Now look at what followed in the United Kingdom simultaneously. Margaret Thatcher, who came to power in 1979, watched the American experiment with close attention. In 1984, she faced her own version, the miners' strike. Arthur Scargill and the National Union of Mine Workers against the full machinery of the British state. The strike lasted a year, 365 days, the longest, most brutal industrial confrontation in post-war British history. When it ended in March 1985, the miners had gained nothing. The pit closures proceeded. The union was broken. British coal mining as an industry was finished within a decade. Thatcher, like Reagan, had prepared. She had spent years stockpiling coal reserves, precisely so that a miners' strike could not hold the country to ransom. The preparation was the strategy. The confrontation was the confirmation of a decision already made. 2 countries, 2 governments, 4 years apart, the same lesson applied with the same result. By the mid-1980s, the framework that had governed the relationship between workers and employers since the end of the Second World War was gone. In both the United States and Britain, the productivity-wage link that had functioned for 30 years was severing. The forensic data on both sides of the Atlantic shows the same inflection point, the same break in the line, the same year. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just fires 11,345 people and waits for you to understand what that meant. The lesson from 1981 did not stay in 1981. It compounded. Every year, in every industry, in every negotiation between an employer and a worker, the weight of that precedent pressed down on one side of the table. Not once, every time. Here is the data, and the data does not lie. In 1983, 1% of American workers belonged to a union. That is the first year the Bureau of Labor Statistics began tracking this figure consistently. 1 in 5 workers. By 2024, that figure stands at 9%. 1 in 10. In the private sector specifically, the collapse is more severe. In 1983, private sector union density was 8%. In 2024, it is 9%. The lowest number ever recorded. Less than 1 in 17 private sector workers now has collective bargaining standing behind them. Let those numbers sit for a moment. In 40 years, private sector union membership has fallen by more than 2/3. The pricing mechanism that kept the wage floor elevated across the entire economy did not weaken slowly. It was systematically removed, sector by sector, decade by decade, using the template written in 1981 and refined every year since. And now look at what happened to wages the moment that mechanism was gone. Between 1948 and 1979, productivity and wages grew together. The system functioned. After 1979, something changed. Between 1979 and 2019, net productivity in the American economy grew 59.7%. That is the output per worker, the value created per hour, rising consistently for 40 years. The economy was generating more wealth per worker than at any previous point in its history. Wages for a typical worker grew 15.8% over that same period. Productivity up 59.7%. Pay up 15.8%. A gap of 43.9 percentage points. That gap did not appear because workers became less valuable. It appeared because the mechanism that captured their share of the value they created had been removed. Between 1979 and 2018, productivity rose approximately 70%. Hourly compensation rose 12%. The economy grew roughly 6 times faster than the pay of the people running it. Where did the rest go? The Economic Policy Institute has documented this precisely. Into corporate profits, into executive compensation, into shareholder returns. The top 1% of earners saw wage growth of 157.3% between 1990 and 2017. The typical worker saw 11.1%. Same economy, same 40 years, completely different outcomes, determined entirely by which side of the power transfer you stood on. And this is where the story changes. The modern worker does not experience this as a statistic. You experience it as a daily reality. You work harder than the generation before you. You are more educated. You produce more output per hour. You are more available, more reachable, more measurable than any worker in history. Tracked by software, monitored by metrics, graded by dashboards. And yet the basic markers of economic participation, the house, the pension, the financial cushion, are further from your reach than they were for your parents at the exact same age, on the same salary adjusted for inflation. That is not a personal failure. That is a structural outcome. Here is the mechanism in plain terms. When union density falls, the wage floor falls with it, not just for union members, for every worker in the surrounding market. The non-union employer who once had to compete with union wages to attract workers no longer needs to compete. The threat is gone. The floor drops. Wages compress toward whatever the individual worker will accept when bargaining alone. And because workers have no collective mechanism to resist, the compression accelerates year after year. You feel this every time you negotiate a salary by yourself across a desk. You feel it every time you are told the budget does not allow for a raise while the company is reporting record profits. You feel it every time loyalty is celebrated in a company all hands and punished in the compensation review. You are not imagining it. The mechanism that would have protected you was dismantled before you arrived. The funeral happened 40 years ago. Nobody sent you the notice. Here is the question that matters. Why did it work so completely? Reagan fired 11,345 people. That is significant. But governments have confronted unions before. What made 1981 different was not the firing. It was the silence that followed. The firing created the silence. And the silence created everything else. When 11,345 people lose their jobs in a single day, and no political consequence follows, two things happen simultaneously. Workers across every other industry absorb the information, and employers across every other industry absorb the same information. The workers learn that the government will not protect them. The employers learn that they do not need to fear the government stepping in on the other side. Both lessons